The day Emmeline Fletcher buried her dead marriage beneath the cottonwood tree, she never expected to find a stranger watching her from atop a chestnut mare, his shadow stretching long across the parched Montana earth. The summer of 1878 had been unforgiving, with drought settling over the land like a fever. Emmeline's hands were raw and blistered from digging in the hard soil, her simple calico dress stained with dust and tears. She'd risen before dawn, determined that today would mark the end. Into the hole went letters tied with faded ribbons, a wedding band that no longer fit, and a tintype of a man who'd promised her the world before abandoning her to the wilderness. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats, didn't realize she had company until a deep voice cut through the morning stillness. "Madam, you all right?" Emmeline startled, nearly toppling into the shallow grave she'd dug. When she looked up, the rising sun silhouetted the rider, turning him into little more than a dark shape against the brightening sky. But even in shadow, she could see he wore a cattleman's hat and a duster coated with the dust of long travel. "This is private property," she said, her voice sharper than intended. Farley's Creek Ranch. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion. Up close, he was taller than she'd first thought, broad-shouldered with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were the color of summer sky, startling in their clarity. "Zachary Blackwood," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I meant no intrusion. Just passing through, and saw someone digging at this hour. Thought there might be trouble." Emmeline clutched the small wooden box that still held the last of her mementos. "No trouble," she said stiffly. "Just burying something that needed burying." His gaze moved from her face to the hole, understanding dawning in his expression. Not pity, she couldn't have borne pity, but something quieter, a recognition. "Need a hand?" he asked simply. She should have sent him away. A proper lady wouldn't entertain a stranger's company, especially not while engaged in something so private. But Emmeline had stopped caring about propriety the day she'd learned her husband had fled to California with another woman, leaving her with a struggling ranch and debts she couldn't fathom. "If you'd like," she found herself saying. Zachary Blackwood nodded, shrugged out of his duster, and knelt beside the hole. In silence, he watched as she placed the box into the earth. Then, without being asked, he began to help her push the dirt back into place. "You're burying more than just things," he observed after a while. Emmeline paused, dirt sifting through her fingers. "My husband left me 16 months ago. Last week I received word he died in San Francisco. Cholera." She didn't know why she was telling him this, a complete stranger. "I reckon I'm burying the life I thought I'd have." Zachary nodded, continuing to work. "The ground will settle," he said. "And the pain will pass too in time." The simple wisdom of his words caught her off guard. When the last of the dirt was patted into place, Emmeline expected him to mount up and continue on his way. Instead, he settled himself at the base of the cottonwood, stretching his long legs out before him. "Mind if I rest a spell?" he asked. "Been writing since before daybreak." Emmeline hesitated, then sat down a respectable distance away. "You said you're passing through. Where are you headed?" "Helena, eventually. I've got family land there, untended these past years while I've been working cattle drives in Texas." "You're a long way north for a Texas cowboy." His mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Time to put down roots again. What about you? You running this place alone?" "Trying to," Emmeline admitted. "My husband James left more debts than assets. I've got 2 hired hands, but they're getting older. We manage the cattle we have, but it's not enough." They sat there as the sun climbed higher, talking of small things, the weather, the price of beef, stories of places they'd seen. When the angle of the sun told her it was nearly noon, Emmeline reluctantly rose. "I have chores waiting," she said. "You're welcome to water your horse at the creek before you move on." Zachary stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. "I appreciate that. And if you've no objection, I might make camp nearby tonight. Get a fresh start in the morning." She should have objected. A widow alone, save for two elderly ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse a quarter-mile from the main house, it wasn't proper to have a strange man camping on her land. But there was something about Zachary Blackwood that put her at ease, a steadiness she hadn't felt in a long time. "There's a clearing by the creek," she said. "It's sheltered from the wind." He touched his hat again. "Much obliged, Mrs. Fletcher." Emmeline walked back to the ranch house, oddly aware of his gaze following her. It wasn't until she was washing up for lunch that she realized she'd spent the entire morning without once feeling the crushing weight of her grief. The pain was still there, but somehow different, as if the burial had indeed changed something. That evening, after the day's work was done, Emmeline found herself walking toward the creek. She told herself she was just checking on the cattle in the south pasture, but her steps carried her to the clearing where a small campfire now burned. Zachary looked up as she approached, seeming unsurprised. "Evening, Mrs. Fletcher." "Please call me Emmeline," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "I came to see if you needed anything." He gestured to the fire, where a small pot of coffee was brewing. "Just some company, if you've a mind to sit a while." Against her better judgment, Emmeline sat on a fallen log across from him. He poured coffee into a tin cup and passed it to her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Tell me about your ranch," he said, settling back. "How long have you been here?" "For years. James brought me here as a bride. He had big dreams, said we'd build the biggest cattle operation in the territory." She sipped the strong coffee. Turned out dreams were all he had. He kept borrowing against what little we had, sure the next venture would be the one to succeed. "And now it's yours to salvage." Emmeline nodded. "For as long as I can hold on. The bank in town is getting impatient." Zachary was quiet for a moment. "I've worked cattle all my life," he finally said. "If you need an extra hand while I'm passing through, I'd be glad to earn my keep." The offer caught her by surprise. "Why would you do that?" "You don't know me." His eyes reflected the dancing flames. "Maybe I recognize someone who could use a bit of help. No strings attached, just honest work for a fair wage." Emmeline should have refused. A proper widow wouldn't hire a drifter she'd just met. But practicality won out over propriety. "I can't pay much," she warned. "I'm not asking for much." And so it was settled. Zachary Blackwood would stay on at Farley's Creek Ranch for a week, helping with the cattle and repairs that had gone too long neglected. Emmeline told herself it was purely practical, that the ranch needed the help desperately. She tried not to think about how his presence made the big, empty house feel less lonely, or how his deep laughter when talking with old Henry and Abe, her hired hands, was the first pleasant sound the ranch had heard in too long. The weeks stretched into 2, and Emmeline found herself watching Zachary when he wasn't looking the confident way he sat a horse, the gentle way he handled the cattle, the respect he showed to Henry and Abe despite their slowing pace. There was a quiet competence about him that reminded her of what she'd once hoped for in a husband, before James had revealed himself to be all talk and ambition with little substance. It was during the 3rd week, as they worked side by side mending fence in the north pasture, that Emmeline finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What are you running from, Zachary Blackwood?" His hands stilled on the wire he was stretching. "What makes you think I'm running? A man with your skills could have steady work on any ranch. Yet you've been drifting, by your own admission. And you seem in no hurry to reach that family land in Helena." Zachary was quiet for so long that Emmeline thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low. "I was married once. Her name was Sarah. We had a little place in West Texas, not much, but it was ours. One night while I was away on a cattle drive, Comanche raiders came through. He drove a fence post into the ground with more force than necessary. There wasn't anything left when I returned." "I'm sorry," Emmeline whispered. "It was 8 years ago now. I couldn't bear to stay there, so I started taking jobs that kept me moving. Never in one place long enough to put down roots, to feel anything too deeply." He gave the wire a final twist to secure it. Been running so long, I'm not sure I know how to stop. Emmeline understood then that they were two broken people, each carrying their own buried past. Perhaps that was why she felt so comfortable in his presence. There was no need to pretend, no need to be stronger than she felt. They worked in companionable silence until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grassland. As they gathered their tools to head back to the ranch house, Zachary's hand brushed against hers, a touch that could have been accidental but lingered just a moment too long. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For asking. For caring enough to want to know." That night, Emmeline lay awake in her bed, listening to the distant coyotes and thinking about Zachary sleeping in the bunkhouse with Henry and Abe. She'd invited a stranger into her life, and somehow in the space of 3 weeks, he'd become someone she looked forward to seeing each morning. It was a dangerous path, she knew. He'd been clear about moving on eventually, and she was still healing, the wound of James's betrayal and death still fresh. But for the first time since receiving that letter about James's death, Emmeline felt something stirring within her, a tentative hope that perhaps life might still hold something sweet for her. The next morning brought a change in the air, a crispness that hinted at the approaching autumn. Emmeline was up early, making a heartier breakfast than usual. She told herself it was because the cooler weather demanded more substantial fare, not because she enjoyed watching Zachary's appreciation of her cooking. He appeared at the kitchen door just as she was taking biscuits from the oven, his hair damp from washing up at the pump outside. "Something smells mighty fine," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Just breakfast," Emmeline replied, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. "Henry and Abe not with you?" "They're seeing to the horses. Said they'd be along directly." Zachary moved to the stove, peering into the pot of bubbling oatmeal. "Anything I can do to help?" His presence in her kitchen felt both foreign and strangely right, as if he belonged there in a way James never had. James had considered the kitchen women's territory, beneath his attention except at mealtimes. "You could set the table if you don't mind." They moved around each other in the small space, an unconscious dance of passing plates and avoiding collisions. When Henry and Abe finally trudged in, they exchanged knowing glances that Emmeline pretended not to see. Over breakfast, they discussed the day's work. Cattle needed moving to fresh pasture, a section of roof on the barn required patching before the rainy season, and supplies were running low, necessitating a trip into town. "I can handle the supply run," Zachary offered. "Been meaning to send a telegram to my cousin in Helena anyway, let him know I'm delayed." "I'll come with you," Emmeline said, surprising herself. "There are some things we need that the general store might not stock without asking." The ride into the small town of Cottonwood Springs took nearly 2 hours. They traveled side by side, conversation flowing easily between them. Zachary told her about his childhood in Kentucky, his father's horse breeding business, and how he'd headed west after the war with nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. Emmeline shared stories of her own upbringing in Missouri, her schoolteacher parents who had died of influenza when she was 19, leaving her alone until James Fletcher had swept into town with his grand plans and charming smile. "He could talk anyone into anything," she admitted. "Even me, and I prided myself on being practical." "Don't be too hard on yourself," Zachary said. "Hope is a powerful thing when you're young and alone." When they reached town, Emmeline was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. In a place as small as Cottonwood Springs, a widow riding into town with an unknown man was prime fodder for gossip. "Perhaps we should split up," she suggested as they tied their horses outside the general store. "I have some personal errands at the dressmaker's." Zachary nodded, understanding her concern. "I'll see to the supplies and meet you back here in an hour." Emmeline hurried through her errands, keenly aware of the whispers that followed her. Mrs. Holbrook at the dressmaker shop was particularly bold in her inquiries. "I see you've hired new help at the ranch. she said as she measured Emmeline for a repair to her Sunday dress. Handsome fellow. Where's he from? Mr. Blackwood is passing through. Emmeline replied coolly. He was kind enough to lend his expertise while preparing for his journey north. Mrs. Holbrook hummed, not bothering to hide her skepticism. Well, a widow alone needs to be careful of her reputation, dear. People talk. Emmeline left the shop with her cheeks burning, anger and embarrassment warring within her. She'd forgotten how cruel small towns could be, how quick to judge. James had been gone for over a year before his death, yet she'd maintained a spotless reputation through isolation and hard work. Now one trip to town with Zachary threatened to undo all that. She was so distracted by these thoughts that she nearly collided with Samuel Vaughn outside the bank. Vaughn was the bank manager who held the notes on her ranch, a man whose thin smile never reached his eyes. Mrs. Fletcher, he said, tipping his hat with false courtesy. What a pleasant surprise. I was just thinking about sending a rider out to your place. Emmeline's stomach tightened. Is there a problem, Mr. Vaughn? Just a matter of business. Your last payment was somewhat less than the amount we agreed upon. The drought affected our calf crop this year, Emmeline explained, hating the defensive note in her voice. I explained that in my letter. The fall sale will make up the difference. Vaughn's smile thinned further. Yes, well, promises don't satisfy investors, Mrs. Fletcher. They're beginning to wonder if a woman alone can manage such an enterprise. Before Emmeline could respond, a shadow fell across them as Zachary appeared at her side, his arms loaded with supplies. Afternoon, he said pleasantly, though his eyes were watchful. Everything all right here? Vaughn's gaze shifted between them, calculation evident in his expression. Mr. Vaughn was just expressing concern about my ability to run the ranch, Emmeline said, a new boldness in her voice. Being a woman alone, you understand. Zachary's smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes hardened. Is that so? Well, Mrs. Fletcher isn't alone. She has loyal hands and friends who recognize her capabilities. He shifted the packages to extend his hand. Zachary Blackwood. Vaughn took the offered hand with obvious reluctance. Samuel Vaughn, Cottonwood Springs Bank. You're new to these parts, Mr. Blackwood? Just helping out at Farley's Creek for the time being, Zachary replied easily. Fine operation Mrs. Fletcher runs. Shows real promise with the right investment. Something in his tone, the subtle emphasis on investment, made Vaughn blink in surprise. Yes, well, investments require return, Mr. Blackwood. Business is business. Indeed it is, Zachary agreed. And smart business recognizes potential. If you'll excuse us, we have supplies to load before the ride home. As they walked away, Emmeline felt a curious mixture of gratitude and irritation. I don't need rescuing, you know, she said once they were out of earshot. Never thought you did, Zachary replied, adjusting his grip on the packages. But sometimes it helps to have someone else in your corner when facing vultures. The description was so apt that Emmeline couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the encounter draining away. That's exactly what he is. Has been circling the ranch since James left, waiting for me to fail. Well, he'll have a long wait, I reckon. They loaded their supplies onto the pack horses they'd brought for that purpose. As they worked, Emmeline noticed Zachary glancing repeatedly toward the saloon across the street. Something on your mind? She asked. He hesitated. There's something I need to do before we head back. Would you mind waiting a few minutes? Curious, Emmeline nodded. I'll wait with the horses. Zachary crossed to the saloon, disappearing inside. He emerged less than 10 minutes later, his expression unreadable as he returned to her side. Everything all right? She asked. Just needed information, he said, mounting his horse. Let's head back before it gets too late. They were well outside of town when Emmeline's curiosity got the better of her. What kind of information were you seeking in a saloon? Zachary was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. I asked about cattle buyers. Specifically, Any who might be interested in prime stock without going through the usual fall auctions. Emmeline reined her horse to a stop. Why would you do that? Because Vaughn is right about one thing: you need money sooner rather than later if you're going to hold on to that ranch. He turned in his saddle to face her. I know some people, Emmeline. Honest buyers who pay fair prices. If you were willing to sell some of your stock now instead of waiting for the fall sales, you might get enough to satisfy the bank until next season. Emmeline stared at him, uncertain whether to be angry at his presumption or grateful for his thinking. That's my decision to make, she said finally. Of course it is, he agreed readily. I'm just putting the option in front of you. You know your situation better than anyone. They rode in silence for several miles, the tension between them palpable. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Emmeline spoke.
I'm sorry.
I shouldn't have snapped at you. It's just, I've been fighting so hard to prove I can do this on my own. I understand pride, Emmeline. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. She studied his profile, strong and steady against the backdrop of the Montana sky. Why are you really helping me, Zachary? And don't say it's just for a fair wage. We both know I'm barely paying you enough to feed yourself. His smile was small but genuine. Maybe I like the company. Maybe after 8 years of running, I found something worth stopping for, at least for a little while. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. By unspoken agreement, they urged their horses to a faster pace, as if physical movement could outrun the emotions threatening to overtake them. That night, after a quiet supper with Henry and Abe, Emmeline sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The sound of boot steps on wood announced Zachary's approach before he appeared from the shadows. Mind if I join you? He asked. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. I've been thinking about what you said about the cattle buyers. And I think it's worth considering. But I'd want to know more before making any decisions. Zachary nodded. Fair enough. I can arrange a meeting if you'd like. I would. Emmeline hesitated, then added, Thank you. For thinking of it, I mean, just trying to be useful. He leaned back in the chair, stretching his long legs out before him. This is a fine place you have here, Emmeline. Worth fighting for. It's the only home I have left, she admitted. When James first brought me here, despite all the hardships, I fell in love with the land. The way the mountains look at sunset, the sound of the creek in spring, even the howl of coyotes at night, it got under my skin. I understand that. Land can claim you that way, make you belong to it as much as it belongs to you. They sat in companionable silence as full darkness settled around them. In the distance, an owl called, its mournful hoot echoing across the night. Will you tell me about her? Emmeline asked softly. Your wife. If the question surprised him, Zachary didn't show it. Sarah was
bright.
That's the word that always comes to mind. Bright smile, bright laugh. She had red hair that caught the sun like copper. We grew up neighbors in Kentucky, childhood sweethearts who married young. His voice was steady, but Emmeline could hear the undercurrent of pain beneath the words. She wanted to go west, to have adventures. I was the cautious one, if you can believe it. But she convinced me, like she always did. A small smile touched his lips at the memory. We homesteaded in West Texas, built our little place from nothing. Had 3 good years before. When his voice trailed off, Emmeline reached across the space between them, her hand finding his in the darkness. I'm sorry, she said again, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing better to offer. His fingers tightened around hers. For a long time, I blamed myself for not being there, for surviving when she didn't. Took me years to realize that guilt wasn't honoring her memory, just keeping me from living. Is that when you decided to go to Helena?
Partly.
My cousin's been writing me for years, asking me to come help with the family land there. I kept putting him off, telling myself I wasn't ready to settle again. Truth is, I was afraid. Of what? His thumb traced a pattern on the back of her hand, sending shivers up her arm despite the warm evening. Of feeling something again. Loss leaves a hollow place inside you. After a while, you get used to it being there. The thought of filling it up again, of having something to lose. It's terrifying. Emmeline understood that fear all too well. James's desertion had left her hollow, his death closing off any possibility of resolution. The thought of trusting someone again, of making herself vulnerable to that kind of pain, was indeed terrifying. Yet sitting here in the darkness, her hand in Zachary's, she felt something stirring in that hollow place, fragile and tentative, but undeniably alive. I should turn in, she said finally, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. Tomorrow will come early. Zachary stood when she did, ever the gentleman. Good night, Emmeline. As she reached the door, she turned back to find him still watching her. Zachary? I'm glad you were passing through that morning. His smile was visible even in the dimness. So am I. The next week brought a frenzy of activity to the ranch. True to his word, Zachary arranged for a cattle buyer to visit a well-respected man from Wyoming who offered fair prices for a portion of Emmeline's stock. The sale wouldn't make her rich, but it would satisfy the bank for now and provide enough extra to hire an additional hand for the coming season. With the immediate financial pressure eased, Emmeline found herself thinking more about the future and about Zachary's place in it. He had made no move to continue his journey to Helena, and she had not asked when he planned to leave. They existed in a strange limbo, their days filled with shared work and their evenings with quiet conversations that gradually revealed more of themselves to each other. It was during one such evening, as they sat by the creek watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, that Zachary finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. I got a letter from my cousin today, he said, skimming a stone across the water surface. He's wondering when I'll arrive. Emmeline felt her heart constrict.
Oh.
I suppose you'll be leaving soon, then. Zachary threw another stone, watching it bounce 4 times before sinking. That depends. On what? He turned to face her, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. On whether there's a reason for me to stay. The directness of his gaze left no doubt about his meaning. Emmeline looked away, overwhelmed by the emotions rising within her. Zachary, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I know this is sudden and complicated. I just wanted you to know that I'm not just passing through anymore. Not if there's a chance for something more. Emmeline stared at the darkening water, trying to sort through the tangle of her feelings. Part of her wanted to throw caution to the wind, to tell him yes, stay, build a life here with me. But another part, the part still healing from James's betrayal, urged caution. I care for you, she admitted finally. More than I thought possible after everything that happened with James. But I'm afraid, Zachary. Afraid of making another mistake, of trusting too easily. I understand fear, he said softly. But I also understand that sometimes the things most worth having require risk. He reached for her hand, his touch warm against her skin. I'm not asking for promises, Emmeline. Just a chance to see what might grow between us. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught their attention. They turned to see Henry riding toward them, his usual unhurried pace replaced by urgent speed. Miss Emmeline, he called as he drew near. Ryder Cummings says he's got news from town. They hurried back to the ranch house, where a dust-covered young man from the telegraph office was waiting. Mrs. Fletcher, he said, touching his hat. Got an urgent message for you from California. Telegraph operator thought you'd want to know right away. With trembling hands, Emmeline accepted the folded paper. As she read the brief message, the blood drained from her face. What is it? Zachary asked, concern evident in his voice. It's about James, she whispered.
He's alive.
The news hit like a physical blow. James Fletcher, who she had mourned and buried in spirit if not in body, was alive. The telegram was brief but clear. Her husband had recovered from his illness and was now making his way back to Montana, expected to arrive within the fortnight. There must be some mistake, Emmeline said, reading the telegram for the third time. The letter from San Francisco was so specific: cholera, a pauper's grave. Who sent that letter? Zachary asked, his voice carefully controlled. A woman who claimed to be his landlady. She returned his personal effects, his pocket watch, some letters. Emmeline sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Why would someone lie about such a thing? The messenger cleared his throat awkwardly. If you don't mind my saying, madam, there's been some talk in town. Mr. Vaughn at the bank mentioned just yesterday that your husband might be returning. Said it would change things regarding the ranch loans. Zachary's expression darkened. Did he now? And how would Vaughn know such a thing before Mrs. Fletcher? The young man shrugged. Can't say, sir. Just passing along what I heard. After the messenger departed, promising to relay any further telegrams immediately, Emmeline sat in stunned silence. Zachary moved about the kitchen, brewing coffee neither of them really wanted, his movements betraying the tension he was trying to conceal. If James is alive, Emmeline said finally, and if he's coming back, then legally the ranch is still his. All of it. Do you believe he's really alive? Zachary asked, setting a cup before her. Emmeline stared into the dark liquid. I don't know what to believe anymore. But if he is. If he's coming back. She couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too overwhelming. Then I'll need to move on. Zachary completed the thought, his voice flat. The reality of those words struck Emmeline with unexpected force. In the short weeks since Zachary had found her burying her past beneath the cottonwood tree, he had become essential to her in ways she was only now beginning to fully comprehend. I don't want you to go, she admitted, looking up to meet his gaze. Something flared in his eyes, hope mingled with pain. I can't stay if he returns, Emmeline. You know that. But what if, she broke off, the half-formed possibilities too nebulous to voice. Zachary knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Listen to me. We don't know for certain that he's alive. We don't know what's really happening. But whatever comes, I won't leave you to face it alone unless you ask me to. His promise steadied her, gave her something to hold onto amid the swirling uncertainty. What should we do? First, we need more information. Zachary's practical nature asserted itself. I'll ride into town tomorrow, send some telegrams of my own. There are people I know in San Francisco who can confirm whether James was really there, whether he really had cholera. And if he is alive and coming back. Zachary's jaw tightened. Then we'll deal with that when the time comes. That night, sleep eluded Emmeline. She paced the floors of the ranch house, every creak and settle of the old buildings setting her nerves on edge. Dawn found her sitting on the porch, watching as the eastern sky lightened from black to deep blue to the fiery orange of sunrise. She heard Zachary before she saw him, his footsteps deliberately heavy on the path from the bunkhouse, giving her warning of his approach. He carried 2 steaming cups, offering one to her as he sat beside her on the porch steps. You didn't sleep, he observed. Neither did you, by the looks of it. He acknowledged this with a slight nod. Been thinking. About Samuel Vaughn knowing your husband might be alive before you did. About a mysterious landlady sending news of his death when he wasn't dead. Zachary sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. It doesn't add up, Emmeline. She had been thinking the same thing through her sleepless night. You think it's some kind of scheme? I think it's worth looking into. Land grabbing isn't uncommon in these parts. A woman alone, a ranch in debt, you'd be an easy target for someone like Vaughn. The suggestion sparked a different kind of fire in Emmeline, anger replacing the confusion and fear of the previous evening. If Vaughn is behind this, if this is some trick to force me off my land. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Zachary cautioned. First, We need facts. He rode into town shortly after breakfast, promising to return by nightfall with whatever information he could gather. Emmeline threw herself into ranch work with unusual vigor, as if physical exhaustion might quiet her racing thoughts. Henry and Abe, sensing her distress but not knowing its cause, gave her space while keeping a watchful eye. It was Abe who finally approached her as she aggressively chopped firewood in the late afternoon. "Miss Emmeline," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Don't mean to pry, but seems to me you're working hard enough for 3 people today." Emmeline paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her arm. "Just keeping busy, Abe." The old ranch hand nodded sagely. "Trouble has a way of finding folks no matter how busy they keep. Better to face it head-on, my pa always said." She leaned on the axe handle, suddenly aware of how tired she was. What if the trouble is too big to face? Then you don't face it alone. Abe glanced toward the trail that led to town. "That Blackwood fella, he's good people. Known it since I first laid eyes on him. Whatever's troubling you, Miss Emmeline, I reckon he'd stand with you through it." The simple assessment brought unexpected tears to Emmeline's eyes. "Thank you, Abe." The old man looked embarrassed by her emotion, shuffling his feet. "Just calling it like I see it. Now, how about you let me finish this wood, and you get some rest before you work yourself into the ground?" Emmeline relinquished the axe, suddenly aware of how her muscles ached. As she walked back to the house, she realized Abe was right about more than just her need for rest. Whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Zachary returned just as darkness was falling, his expression grim as he dismounted in the ranch yard. Emmeline, who had been watching for him from the porch, hurried to meet him. "What did you find out?" she asked, searching his face for clues. "Let's talk inside," he said, his voice low. In the kitchen, with the lamp turned up and coffee brewing on the stove, Zachary laid out what he'd discovered. "I sent telegrams to contacts in San Francisco and received replies from 2 of them. No James Fletcher was treated for cholera in any hospital there in the past 6 months. No death certificate was filed." He pulled several papers from his pocket, spreading them on the table. "But I did learn that Samuel Vaughn has been buying up ranches all through this valley, usually after foreclosure." "That's hardly surprising," Emmeline said. "He's the bank manager." "The bank doesn't own those properties, Emmeline. Vaughn does, personally. And there's more." Zachary hesitated. "The telegram announcing your husband's imminent return? It was sent from Helena, not California." Emmeline stared at him, trying to process this information. "Helena? But that doesn't make sense. James has no connections in Helena." "No, but Vaughn does. He has a brother there who works for the railroad." Zachary's expression hardened. "I think Vaughn is playing some kind of game, Emmeline. First a false death notice to see how you'd react, then a false resurrection to pressure you into selling." The pieces began to fit together in Emmeline's mind. "The day we saw him in town, he seemed rattled when you introduced yourself, when you implied you might be investing in the ranch." "You were supposed to be desperate and alone," Zachary agreed. "My presence complicated his plans." Anger surged through Emmeline, hot and clarifying.
"So what do we do now?"
"How do we prove what he's doing?" "We set a trap," Zachary said simply. "We let Vaughn think his plan is working. Let him believe you're desperate enough to sell before your husband returns. And then what? Then we catch him in his own lie." The plan they formulated that night was risky, dependent on timing and Vaughn's predictable greed. The next morning, Emmeline rode into town alone, presenting herself at the bank with an air of barely controlled panic. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "I've received word that my husband is alive and returning to Montana." Vaughn's thin smile didn't quite mask his satisfaction. "Yes, quite remarkable news. I heard something of the sort myself. If James returns, he'll ruin everything I've built," Emmeline continued, allowing tears to well in her eyes. The ranch is finally starting to prosper. I won't let him take it from me. Vaughn leaned forward, the predator scenting prey. That is a difficult situation, Mrs. Fletcher. Legally speaking, the property is still in your husband's name. I know, Emmeline said miserably. That's why I've come to you. I want to sell the ranch before he arrives. A clean break, a fresh start somewhere else. Interest sharpened Vaughn's gaze.
Sell?
Well, the bank could certainly consider making an offer, though given the outstanding loans, it wouldn't be substantial. I don't need substantial, Emmeline insisted. Just enough to start over somewhere else. But it has to be quickly, before James arrives. How quickly? The telegram said he'd be here within 2 weeks. So, as soon as possible. Vaughn made a show of considering, though Emmeline could see he was already mentally calculating his profit. I could perhaps arrange something by the end of the week. A cash transaction, very discreet. Thank you, Emmeline said, injecting profound relief into her voice. I'll be ready. As she left the bank, she felt Vaughn's eyes following her, no doubt already planning how to develop her land once it was his. The thought made her skin crawl, but she maintained her defeated posture until she was well away from town. Zachary was waiting at the agreed meeting point, a small stand of trees a mile outside Cottonwood Springs. His face was tense with concern until he saw her approaching. It worked, she called as she drew near. He took the bait completely. Relief transformed Zachary's expression.
Good.
Did he mention a specific date for the sale? End of the week. He seemed eager to conclude matters before James could arrive. Perfect. Zachary helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. That gives us 3 days to prepare the second part of our plan. The second part was more complex, requiring the cooperation of several people. Zachary rode to the neighboring ranch, owned by the Miller family, who had their own reasons to distrust Vaughn after nearly losing their property to the bank the previous year. Tom Miller, a gruff but fair-minded man, agreed to help after hearing their suspicions. Meanwhile, Emmeline prepared the ranch as if for imminent sale, making sure word got back to town about her activities. She even visited the general store to inquire about coach tickets to Denver, ensuring the gossip would spread quickly. The night before their planned confrontation, Emmeline sat with Zachary by the creek, the same spot where they'd been when the telegram about James arrived. The air was cooler now, autumn asserting itself in earnest, and Zachary had built a small fire to ward off the chill. Are you nervous about tomorrow? He asked, watching the flames dance. A little, Emmeline admitted. But mostly I'm angry. Angry that Vaughn thought he could manipulate me this way, that he would use my grief and fear against me. Men like Vaughn see only opportunity in others' pain, Zachary said. It's how they've always operated. Emmeline stared into the fire, remembering the day Zachary had first found her beneath the cottonwood tree. When I buried those things, James's letters, my wedding ring, I thought I was burying my past, letting go of the pain. I never imagined I'd be fighting for my future so soon afterward. Life has a way of forcing us forward when we're ready or not. Zachary reached for her hand, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting in recent days. But I meant what I said before, Emmeline. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes after I'm with you, if you want me to be. She turned to face him, reading the sincerity in his eyes. In that moment, with the firelight casting shadows across his face and the creek murmuring beside them, Emmeline made her decision. I do want that, she said softly. I want you to stay, Zachary. Not just for tomorrow, but for all the tomorrows after. His eyes widened, hope lighting them from within. Are you certain? After everything with James, I'd understand if you needed more time. I've spent too much time already living in the shadow of a man who never truly loved me. I won't waste more of it being afraid to reach for happiness when it's right in front of me. Zachary's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. Slowly, Giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Emmeline's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, her heart beating a rhythm of yes and finally, and at last. When they eventually parted, breathless and a little dazed, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since I first saw you under that cottonwood tree," he confessed. Emmeline laughed softly. "Even with me all dusty and teary-eyed, bearing my past in a hole?" "Especially then. You looked so fierce and determined, even in your grief. I knew right then you were someone special." They stayed by the creek until the fire burned low, talking of the future they hoped to build together after Vaughn was exposed. It would not be easy. The ranch needed work, and there would always be those in town who looked askance at their unconventional beginning, but together, they felt equal to any challenge. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect Montana autumn day. Emmeline dressed with care in her best dress, a dark blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Zachary, too, had made an effort, wearing a clean shirt and his least-worn trousers, his usual cowboy hat exchanged for a more formal felt one. "Ready?" he asked as they prepared to ride into town. Emmeline nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Ready." Samuel Vaughn was waiting at the bank when they arrived, a stack of papers already prepared on his desk. His smug expression faltered slightly when he saw Zachary accompanying Emmeline. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, pointedly ignoring Zachary. "I wasn't expecting you to bring company. Mr. Blackwood has been advising me on business matters," Emmeline replied smoothly. "I thought it prudent to have him review the sale documents." Vaughn's thin lips compressed further, but he gestured to the chairs before his desk. "As you wish. Though I must say, our agreement was for a discreet transaction." "And it shall be," Emmeline assured him, taking a seat. "Now, shall we proceed?" For the next half hour, Vaughn walked them through the sale documents, explaining in condescending detail the terms of the agreement. The price he offered was insultingly low, barely covering the outstanding loans with a pittance left over for Emmeline's fresh start. Throughout his explanation, Zachary remained silent, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Vaughn finally pushed the papers across the desk for Emmeline's signature, she hesitated, her pen poised above the document. "Before I sign, Mr. Vaughn, I'd like to clarify one point. This sale is necessitated by my husband's imminent return, correct?" Vaughn's smile was thin and satisfied. "As you yourself informed me, Mrs. Fletcher. A most remarkable circumstance, his recovery from what you believed was a fatal illness." "Yes, remarkable indeed." Emmeline set down the pen. "So remarkable, in fact, that I'd like to know how you learned of it before I did." The banker blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. I'm not sure what you mean." "The messenger from the telegraph office mentioned that you were discussing my husband's return before I received the telegram informing me of it," Emmeline said, her voice hardening. "How did you come by that information, Mr. Vaughn?" Vaughn's face reddened. "Town gossip, nothing more. Perhaps there was an earlier telegram that was delayed in delivery. Or perhaps," Zachary spoke for the first time, his voice dangerously quiet, "there never was a James Fletcher recovering in San Francisco. Perhaps there was only a banker with land-grabbing ambitions and a talent for forgery. This is outrageous." Vaughn sputtered, half rising from his chair. "I won't be accused." "Of what, Mr. Vaughn?" The new voice came from the doorway, where Sheriff Miller, Tom Miller's brother, now stood. "Of fraud? Of forging telegrams? Of conspiring to defraud a widow of her property?" The blood drained from Vaughn's face as he saw not only the sheriff, but several prominent townspeople behind him, including the telegraph operator and the editor of the local newspaper. "This is a private business meeting," Vaughn said, his voice thin with suppressed panic. "I must ask you all to leave." "I think not," said the sheriff, stepping fully into the room. We've received some very interesting information about your business practices, Vaughn. Seems you've been buying up ranches all through the valley using some questionable methods. Preposterous, Vaughn snapped, though his eyes darted nervously to the door as if calculating an escape route. I've done nothing illegal. Then you won't mind explaining these, Zachary said, producing several papers from his pocket. Telegrams from San Francisco confirming that James Fletcher was never treated for cholera there. And this, he laid down another paper. A telegram from the railroad office in Helena, where your brother works, showing that he sent the message about James Fletcher's recovery on your instructions. Vaughn's face contorted with rage. You've been investigating me? On what authority? On the authority of a woman defending her home, Emmeline said, rising to her feet. Did you really think I would simply accept such a convenient death and resurrection without question? Did you think me so weak and frightened that I would give up everything I've worked for? The banker's eyes narrowed with malice. Your precious ranch is still in debt, Mrs. Fletcher. James Fletcher abandoned it, and you. Even without this sale, I'll have it eventually. I wouldn't count on that, Tom Miller said, pushing forward. The Cattlemen's Association has taken an interest in your banking practices, Vaughn. Seems you've been applying different loan terms to different ranchers more favorable to those willing to sell to you personally when they can't meet your deliberately harsh payment schedules. And that, added the sheriff, is fraud. Bank fraud, to be specific, which I believe is a federal offense. Vaughn's face had gone from red to white and back again during this exchange. When the sheriff stepped forward with handcuffs, the fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. This isn't over, he hissed as the sheriff led him away. That ranch will never prosper. You'll see. Actually, Zachary said, his arm slipping around Emmeline's waist, I think you're wrong about that. I think Farley's Creek Ranch has a very bright future indeed. The aftermath of Vaughn's arrest threw Cottonwood Springs into an uproar. As investigations revealed the extent of his schemes, numerous property transactions came under scrutiny. The bank's board of directors, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, appointed a new manager who approached Emmeline with an offer to restructure her loans on more favorable terms. It seems the bank is suddenly very interested in my success, she remarked to Zachary as they rode home from town after finalizing the new arrangement. Amazing how the threat of bad publicity can change attitudes, he agreed with a wry smile. Though I suspect Tom Miller's influence with the Cattlemen's Association didn't hurt either. The autumn days grew shorter, the nights colder. With the ranch's immediate financial future secured, Emmeline and Zachary turned their attention to preparations for winter and, more significantly, to planning their life together. I've been thinking, Zachary said one evening as they sat before the fire in the ranch house. We should make it official before winter sets in. No sense in me continuing to sleep in the bunkhouse when it's going to be 20 below zero. Emmeline laughed, setting aside her mending. Is that a proposal, Zachary Blackwood? Not a very romantic one, he admitted, moving to kneel before her chair. Taking her hands in his expression grew serious. Let me try again. Emmeline Fletcher, when I found you burying your past that morning, I never imagined I was also finding my future. You've brought light back into my life after years of darkness. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Tears pricked at Emmeline's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Henry and Abe standing as witnesses and Tom Miller's wife organizing a modest celebration afterward. The news about James had been clarified, as well a letter from San Francisco confirmed that James Fletcher had indeed died, though months earlier than the false letter had claimed, and from complications of alcoholism rather than cholera. He never found what he was looking for, Emmeline said as she and Zachary stood before the cottonwood tree on their wedding day, the same spot where he had first found her. Always chasing the next opportunity, the next adventure, never content with what was right in front of him. His loss, Zachary said, drawing her close. My gain. The first snow fell on Farley's Creek Ranch, now officially Blackwood Ranch, in early December, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse that glittered in the winter sun. Emmeline stood at the window of the ranch house, watching as Zachary trudged through the drifts to check on the cattle in the nearby sheltered pasture. It had been just over 4 months since that morning when she dug a hole beneath the cottonwood tree, intending to bury her past and face an uncertain future alone. Instead, she'd found a partner who understood both her pain and her strength, who had sat with her until the ground settled and her heart healed. As she watched Zachary's tall figure moving through the snow, Emmeline placed a hand on her still flat stomach, smiling at the secret she would share with him that evening. Life, it seemed, was full of unexpected gifts for those brave enough to keep their hearts open. The future stretched before them like the untouched snow, clean, bright, and full of possibility. Whatever challenges came, they would face them together, their love forged in the healing of old wounds and the promise of new beginnings. When Zachary returned, stomping snow from his boots on the porch, Emmeline met him at the door with a kiss that spoke of home and hearth and the forever kind of love that neither time nor hardship could diminish. "Welcome home," she said, drawing him inside to the warmth. And as the winter wind whistled around the corners of their house, Emmeline knew with bone-deep certainty that she had finally found where she belonged, not in a place, but in the arms of a man who had been brave enough to stop running and sit with her until her pain passed and new joy could take root. Spring came early to the Montana Territory that year, as if eager to showcase the renewal taking place at Blackwood Ranch. The creek ran high with snowmelt, the pastures greened almost overnight, and wildflowers dotted the hillsides in cheerful profusion. Emmeline's pregnancy progressed without complications, her body blossoming as the land did. Zachary fussed over her in ways that would have irritated her had they not been so clearly born of love rather than doubt in her capabilities. He hired 2 young men to help with the ranch work, ensuring Emmeline wouldn't push herself too hard as her condition advanced. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she protested one afternoon when he insisted on taking over the bread making. "Humor me," Zachary replied, pressing a flour-dusted kiss to her forehead. "I've waited too long for this happiness to take any chances with it." Their daughter was born on a perfect June morning, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and meadowlarks singing in the cottonwood tree. They named her Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, Sarah for the wife Zachary had lost, Elizabeth for Emmeline's mother. When Zachary held her for the first time, his hands dwarfing the tiny bundle, the look of wonder on his face made Emmeline fall in love with him all over again. "She's perfect," he whispered, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. "Absolutely perfect." As summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to another winter, the rhythm of their life together settled into something both comfortable and exhilarating. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Zachary's practical knowledge of cattle and Emmeline's head for business proving a formidable combination. They still visited the cottonwood tree occasionally, the place where their story had begun. Sometimes Zachary would find Emmeline there alone, lost in thought, and would simply sit beside her until she was ready to share what was on her mind. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't been passing by that morning?" she asked him once, as they watched little Sarah toddle among the wildflowers at the tree's base. "Sometimes," Zachary admitted. "But then I remember something my father used to say, that life has a way of bringing you exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. I was meant to find you that day, Emmeline. Just as you were meant to find me." Emmeline leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter discover the world with all the wonder and courage of new life. "I think you're right," she said softly. "Some things are just meant to be." The years that followed brought more children, twin boys who inherited their father's blue eyes and their mother's determined spirit, and another daughter who arrived as a surprise blessing when they thought their family complete. The ranch expanded, adding adjacent land when it became available, and the Blackwood name became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing throughout the territory. There were hard times, 2 drought years when the creek ran low and the grass withered, a barn fire that could have been catastrophic had the wind been blowing differently, illness that swept through the community, taking young and old alike. But through it all, Emmeline and Zachary faced each challenge together, their partnership only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Zachary surprised Emmeline with a special gift, a small silver locket containing portraits of their children on one side and, on the other, a tiny pinch of soil from beneath the cottonwood tree. "To remember where we started," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "And how far we've come." Emmeline touched the locket, tears blurring her vision. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed. "After James left, I believed that part of my life was over." "It was," Zachary said, drawing her into his arms. "But endings make way for beginnings. You taught me that, Emmeline, when you were brave enough to bury your past and face your future." As they stood together in the home they had built with love and perseverance, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, Emmeline knew with absolute certainty that the pain she had once felt was truly, finally past. The ground had settled, her heart had healed, and in its place had grown a joy deeper and more enduring than she could ever have imagined on that distant morning when a passing cowboy had stopped to help a grieving woman bury her past. And that, Emmeline reflected as Zachary's lips found hers in a kiss still passionate after all these years, was the greatest blessing of all.